concerns in India that a key challenge in any program implementation for the government is the implementation capacity with regard to targeting and transferring payments to beneficiaries of social welfare programs. And so the limited capacity of governments to make these transfers has led to significant weaknesses in program performance, and the challenges range at the most basic levels from beneficiary troubles in accessing payments to significant amount of leakages. But this issue of payments infrastructure is not just about public programs, right? At a broader level, the lack of a secure payments infrastructure also constrains the scale and scope of the economy more broadly. So if you think about private transactions, the most basic aspect of any economic transaction is I give you a good or service and you pay me in return, right? And so the scale and the scope of the economy is limited by the range of being able to transfer payments. Omidyar and eBay is kind of a classic example. So here is eBay that has allowed literally hundreds of thousands of people to make a livelihood just by buying and selling things on their computers. But in addition to eBay, they also ended up building, developing, and acquiring PayPal, which was the payment system that allows this to securely transact all of these economic transactions, right? And so this is difficult in less developed countries and typically works through informal networks. So the way you want to think about payments infrastructure, at a most basic level, it's about state capacity, right? Which is the capacity of the state to implement its programs more effectively. But more broadly, you can think about it like public infrastructure, like roads or railways or the internet, because these are all investments that the governments initially made for their own purpose, right? Why did governments build railways? It was to get troops to the border quickly. Why did you build the internet? It was for intra-government communication in the military. But all of these investments ended up having massive spillovers into the private sector. So you start out investing in the perspective of state capacity, but it becomes really a much broader case of public infrastructure, right? There's also the point that the binding constraint might not be the technology as much as the political economy, right? So if what's going on is that these deep entrenched networks of patronage and corruption, they're not going to sit by silently while somebody tries to bring in this new system, and so the empire will strike back, right? And if the empire strikes back, all your fancy technology might not quite get you the returns you hope it'll have. I think the concerns that the kind of, the more rights-based activist crowd have had, including Jean and Ritika, is the exclusion errors, right? That even if you reduce corruption, that you might be making the poorest and most vulnerable communities worse off because they're not able to either access the payments or, if the payment reader doesn't work, if they're the ones who are denied payments, then you really worry about what happens to the poorest and most vulnerable folks. A very subtle kind of criticism has to then do with the fact that even if you reduce corruption, it might be that corruption is the lubricant needed, to keep the government working. So at a very basic level, if the field assistant in NREGS is not able to make any money, he might not even implement the project in the first place, right? So the government might save money from corruption, but that money is not being reallocated to the poor, so you might actually make them worse off by cutting corruption. So this is a much more general point, right? So in general terms, in statistical terms, there's a trade-off between type 1 and type 2 error, right? So if you try to clamp down on corruption, you might be clamping down and preventing genuine beneficiaries from receiving benefits. And then finally, there's issues of cost effectiveness. Okay, so what are we doing here? What we're doing here is 2009, UID is announced, and we get super excited about saying, can we go do something to evaluate this? But it becomes very clear very quickly that the UID itself is only an enabling infrastructure, right? So by itself, the UID is not going to reduce corruption. So unless you integrate it with specific programs, then you're not going to see the impact of what this platform will get you. So what we did was we ended up in Andhra Pradesh, where the AP Smart Card program is for all practical purposes a functional precursor of UID integrated with program benefits in NREGS and Social Security pension. Okay, so at one level, this is version 1.0 because UID envisages online authentication. So this is offline authentication, but it's integrated with the program. And so in that sense, what you have today is 500 million Aadhaar cards, but it hasn't delivered any concrete benefit yet because it's not been integrated with something. So in that sense, working in AP made perfect sense because it was a functional precursor to what would happen if you integrated payments in major public programs with this modern secure payments infrastructure. Right? So the culture, we have a CAG culture that tracks the fund flow and says, did the money reach where it was supposed to reach and did we do what it was supposed to do? But we don't have an impact evaluation culture that says, what was the impact of this spending? Okay? Now, the first thing you need to do is you actually have to define the outcomes. What are the outcomes? So in midday meals, it might be nutrition, attendance, learning outcomes. In smart cards, it might be payments experience, leakage, access. So you got to define these things and you have to measure them, which is never done. let's say you got lucky, okay? You got lucky that somebody defined these outcomes and measured them in a baseline and say, you have some baseline outcomes in 2007, program rolls out, and 5 years later you go and say, ha, here are all these improvements. Now, can you attribute that to this program? No, because there are hundreds of things changing at the same time, right? So in the context of, say, midday meals, incomes are changing, attitudes are changing, tastes are changing. Maybe all the increases in education we've seen have to do with returns to education and perception of returns to education and nothing to do with policy whatsoever, okay? So isolating the impact of any policy and outcomes turns out to be one of the hardest problems in empirical social science, and the best kind of what we're doing here is kind of using the methodology of clinical trials and saying, if you can randomize the rollout of a program so that you have treatment and control groups that are otherwise identical in every way, then any difference you get can be attributed exclusively to the impact of the program. Okay, so this is what JPAL does, but from an implementation perspective, one very clever thing they did is instead of following a model of giving the contract for the whole state to one bank, they followed a one bank, one district model. So they had variation across districts. So in the start, this is painful from a coordination perspective, but ex post, it turns out to be the right thing because you're not held hostage to one vendor who doesn't deliver. So what they were able to do was basically reassign districts from low performing banks to high performing banks. And there were 8 banks, 8 districts where there was no progress whatsoever. And in those 8 districts, they reassigned this to other banks that had already done a good job. And that gave us this window for the randomization, okay? So, and all that we're doing is we're basically staggering the Mandals into 3 phases, okay? So we're saying here's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. One concern with randomized experiments usually are ethical concerns about how can you hold back a control area, okay? But in the context of government, it's never a problem because government does not have the bandwidth to cover 1 billion people overnight anyway, okay? So any program you do is going to have to be phased out. It's just that in practice, the phase out is completely arbitrary and haphazard based on, you know, politicians say, mere district mein karo, yahan pe officer acha, yahan pe karo. So it's just completely unstructured and you don't learn anything from it, right? So given that you have these constraints on implementation capacity anyway, if you can stagger this, I mean, you not only keep it fair, but you can also learn a lot out of the whole process. Now, one point I want to spend some time on, you'll notice that there's 2 handouts you got. One was the impact paper, which is the NBR working paper. But we also wrote from most government officers' perspective, you know, the impact to dur ki baat hai. Most of what you're concerned about is implementation, right? How do I implement better? And it turns out that implementation, of course, is highly non-trivial. And we have a lot of lessons that we've learned in this process. So our team, the JPAL team, was deeply embedded in government. So we sat in every monthly review meeting of the rollouts with the principal secretary, with the banks to kind of see exactly what's going on. So as with anything, there's positives and negatives. On the positive side, the implementation benefited from kind of top-level support in JOAP. By most accounts, it's probably the best administered state as far as EBTs and all of this thing goes. There was JOAP devoted significant senior leadership time. Mr. Raju was in place for 5 years. Mr. Subramaniam was there for 4 years. So Principal Secretary Rural Development was kind of a high priority post for the government that was not disturbed. And they were able to implement at high quality. And because of this one bank, one district model, that allowed them to move market share from failing banks to successful banks. So if you look at Bihar, for example, they had this very ambitious eShakti project, beautifully conceived, but they had one vendor for the whole state. And so it was just high risk. And when the vendor went belly up, I mean, the whole project essentially got stalled for 5 years, okay? So in a way, it's exactly like telecom circles, like delicensing in the 90s. You gave kind of one state different circles, and then the better guys just expanded market share, and the guys who were not good basically whittled down their market share, which is how it should be. So what you want is you want the market share to dynamically adjust to actual performance on the ground. In any procurement process, sitting here and evaluating tenders, I mean, proposal to koi bhi likh sakta hai, okay? So I have no idea, like, I mean, who's going to do a good job till you actually observe people in the field. And so that ends up being a really important lesson in terms of the practice. Now, that being said, there's a lot of things that are also holding back implementation. Even with all of this top-level support, it turns out to be highly non-trivial, okay? So just the basic technical challenges, in particular enrollment, okay? So how do you saturate enrollment is the biggest problem, because you can go in with a camp mode of enrollment, you'll get 30, 40, 50%, but getting 100% enrollment turns out to be really, really difficult, okay? And what's amazing is I think it was Ed Glazer who told us that it took 15 years for the US Social Security Administration to go completely from mailing out paper checks to getting electronic benefit transfers done. right? So you got 75% done in the first 4 years, but that last 25% literally required the old generation to pass away and get newer generation that would take the payments, okay? So it just gives us perspective that this kind of complex project is not something, like, I mean, you should feel bad about that you haven't somehow succeeded with 600 million people in 4 years. These are complex projects. It took the US 15 years, okay? And for those of you who think implementation is easy, I have 2 words for you, all right? It's called healthcare.gov, right? So when you try to implement something like a new healthcare exchange, even in the US, this is highly, highly non-trivial, okay? So let's not forget to give ourselves credit where it's due for getting to something like 50% implementation, and so that's kind of the main lesson from this, okay? So what that means is the results I'm going to give you, we're now moving to the impacts, are based on only 50% coverage, okay? They're not based on 100% coverage, and it's based on a 2-year window between the rollout of the system and when we do our end-line surveys, okay? So which is why you kind of have a win-win in that you not only reduce leakage, but you improved access, because a lot of the siphoning that was going on has now been reduced, because if you're making money anyway, you might as well get work done for that, okay? The next set of results has to do, so the means are positive, okay? So there's a positive reduction, positive improvement in everything. But now you worry about the distributions. Are some people worse off, okay? So maybe average outcomes got better, but there is some left tail of the distribution that was adversely affected. So this is where, like, you know, I mean, it's nice to use a technical term that has a purpose, but first order stochastic domination effectively means that every percentile of a household in a treatment distribution was better off than the corresponding percentile in a control distribution, okay? So what that tells you is nobody was worse off relative to a comparable person in the control area. But on every metric, this distribution basically dominates, okay? So this is time to collect and this is payment lag. So you can't see the light blue line, which is the control area. The dark blue is the treatment. So you're doing better at every percentile of the distribution, and you can see that in the paper, okay? So the next thing is, let's look at the mechanism of impact, because there's 2 things going on. One, we brought the payment closer to the village, and the second is the biometric, right? So one view might be, wait, maybe you don't need the biometric at all, okay? So maybe all that is going on is that you brought the payment closer to the village, and those are the gains you're picking up, right? So do you really need the biometrics? And so what you do here is we're breaking it down. We're breaking down the results by whether you were a carded GP or a uncarded GP. And then within the carded GP, I can look at whether you are a carded beneficiary versus an uncarded beneficiary, okay? And you know, this is part of a 5-year research program that's supported by ON and done by JPAL, kind of thinking about how this technology can be used to reimagine the Indian welfare state, right? So one part of this is implementing existing programs more effectively, and that's what we're doing in AP, because here we have not touched the design of NREGA, right? NREGA is exactly the way it is, and we're not touching program design. But then in Bihar, we are kind of in the first stages of an even more ambitious project of using this infrastructure for cash transfers in the PDS, and that allows us to reimagine the feasible set of policy if you're able to do these transfers, and I'll talk more about that if you want, okay? And I think from a policy perspective, it's just critical to be based on rigorous large-scale evidence as opposed to anecdotes, because the anecdotes can go either way, and it's very, very easy to kind of find a few stories where these things don't work and kind of say, oh, here was a sting operation, like, I mean that, you know, you could pay bribes and get this done. So the moral of that story is you improve implementation. You don't kind of use that to say, I'm going to kill the entire program, okay? So kind of what are the policy implications for financial inclusion, DBT, RBI, and GOI? I think the single biggest point I would make is that there are massive synergies between DBT and FI, and right now everything is working in kind of independent silos, right? And so that the integration of objectives and guidelines can just play a really key role in universal FI. So the RBI is approaching financial inclusion mostly from a regulatory perspective, that I have the power in my regulatory capacity, I insist that you do financial inclusion, and so you're dragging the banks kicking and screaming to kind of open these accounts, and what you get is a bunch of open but non-functional accounts because there's no activity in them, okay? Now what happens with EBTs is the commissions on the DBTs can cover the fixed cost of the entire last mile infrastructure of keeping the system going, and then everything you get over and above that, like, I mean, is bonus. And my sense is that there's massive synergies which are not being exploited at present. I think the other big point is just from a government's perspective, it's important to be willing to pay banks and TSPs to make it incentive compatible. And what we're seeing is AP is the one place that actually paid these 2%. Most other state governments, like, I mean, they're not my sense is the payments are not being made across the board. And the overall approach of the government trying to get things done is I'll twist your arm as opposed to kind of make it incentive compatible. So it just seems that a carrot kind of works better than the sticks. And pricing is a fine art between cost and value. And kind of given that the value is so large, it clearly makes sense to finance the build out of this infrastructure in its initial period. And we pay Visa and MasterCard 2.5%, and we're willing to pay for that convenience. So why would we not do that? Like I mean, in the context of large scale EBTs. And critical operational considerations would be, of course, I think whether it's Aadhaar or whether it's anything else, you need a continuous enrollment setup. But you know, these are things that we can talk about. So let me discuss, end with 3 main points. The first is, why is there still leakage, right? So some people kind of say, "Arey, ye sab biometric hai," and you still have 18-19% leakage. But observe that only 50% of payments are being targeted, done this way. So the government had not shut off uncarded payments, and we don't find any reduction in ghosts, because the remaining 50%, you still have enough scope for the ghosts to be claiming money. And the manual override was possible even in carded payments. So one of the recommendations, if you go to the previous slide, is you need maintenance and transfer of transaction level authentication records, which typically were not available because they were sitting on kind of the, even Fino, it would sit on the Fino server, like I mean, but it wouldn't actually be uploaded at the transaction level. You would just know if it was a carded beneficiary, you wouldn't know if the transaction itself was authenticated. So those are things that you would need to build in over time. The other big question is external validity, right? So will this work outside AP? So even with the best RCT, the largest RCT I've done, it's 20 million people, but it's still 2% of India. So you might say, like, you know, what does this tell me about other places? And I think, you know, the obvious answer is any study is based in a context, and I'm not going to push beyond that. But I think the larger lesson is that AP demonstrated the political will to do it and empowered the bureaucrats to deliver. And it suggests that the returns to exercising that political will in other contexts might be high. Now, does that exist yet? No, but that's kind of, you know, all we'll say is that it's worth investing political capital in implementing at this scale.